Hello, conscious people. In this talk, I'm going to look at three debates between two popular neuroscience theories of consciousness, the Neuronal Global Workspace Theory and the Recurrent Processing Theory. So it's clear we need a better definition of consciousness. Here is just a selection of terms used to name the type of consciousness being studied. This multiplicity is reasonable because there are a number of different aspects of consciousness, and it's useful to examine them separately to get a grip on the complexity of our experiences. But we need to be clear about exactly what we're explaining in order to compare different theories of consciousness. There's a new, very exciting model of consciousness research in neuroscience called adversarial collaboration. And this is where different theorists, different advocates of theories of consciousness get together and agree on research studies that would determine evidence for or against a particular theory of consciousness. So the Neuronal Global Workspace Theory and Recurrent Processing Theory might have a disagreement about exactly how consciousness works, and they propose together a kind of study that would determine which theory was a better theory. And this is a very exciting model to give us some traction on evaluating these different theories of consciousness. But in order for that model to work, it assumes that both theories are talking about the same kind of consciousness. So we need to know what it is that we're trying to explain. What it's like has been used as a pointer to the type of consciousness at issue in the hard problem of consciousness. According to David Chalmers, various different aspects of consciousness are relatively easy to explain: perception, memory, and attention. But the hard problem of consciousness is hard because all of those different aspects of consciousness could go on without there being something it's like to have those experiences. So what it's like is what we're trying to explain. I'm going to focus on three areas of disagreement where parties on both sides of the debate claim to be offering a theory about what it's like to be conscious, to have an experience, but they disagree on these different aspects of what that involves. And the two theories I'm going to compare, as I mentioned, are the Neuronal Global Workspace Theory advocated by Stan DeHaan, and that's color-coded in green, and the Recurrent Processing Theory advocated by Victor Lamme, and the aspects of the debate that he endorses, his theory endorses, are color-coded in blue. So the first aspect, the first debate between these two theorists is whether it's phenomenal consciousness or access consciousness that's at issue. And it might seem that phenomenal consciousness is the clear winner because it's defined as what it's like to have an experience. And philosopher Ned Block introduced this distinction between phenomenal and access consciousness early on in the resurgence of the neuroscience of consciousness research. And so phenomenal consciousness is what it's like, and so that seems like that's what we're trying to explain. But when Block talked about what was involved in phenomenal consciousness, he focused on the qualitative aspects of conscious experience. So the redness of red, the smell of coffee, these sorts of things. And as consciousness research developed, it became clear that these sorts of qualitative features could be processed without there being something it's like for someone to be having these experiences. So there might not be something it's like to see red if you suffer from blind sight or are participating in a masked priming experiment or some other condition. Victor Lamme follows Block in accepting that these sorts of cases do count as phenomenal consciousness so long as they are subject to recurrent processing. And this just seems counterintuitive. It seems wrong to say there's something it's like for a person to see red if there's no way for that person to access their perceptual processing, their sensory processing. So now many people argue that access consciousness is essential to phenomenal consciousness, that if you don't have access, then there isn't anything that it's like for you to be having that experience. And so advocates of the global neuronal workspace theory argue that access consciousness should be what we're trying to explain in explaining consciousness. And this debate leads to a debate between whether the contents of consciousness are rich or spare. So the rich view argues that the contents of consciousness include more than information that's reported or remembered. And Lamme has used the partial report paradigm to argue for this rich view of conscious experience. And in the partial report paradigm, as the figure here shows, subjects are shown a stimulus that is somewhat complex. Here we have several different lines, and then there's a pause, and then some aspect of this complex stimulus is cued, and the subject reports something about that element that's cued. So in this case, it's whether the line direction has stayed the same or it's changed. And subjects can report on any of the lines that are cued, but if they're just asked to report on the whole diagram, then they'll only be able to respond in relation to a couple of the lines. So if you ask them to draw the diagram, for example, they're only going to be able to get a couple of the shapes, and they're not going to be able to report on the whole thing at once, but they can report on any part of the diagram. And according to the advocates of the rich view, this means that they are they're phenomenally conscious of the whole diagram, even though they can only report on one part or another. According to the axis views, this is the wrong interpretation of the partial report paradigm. They say, no, the person is not conscious of the whole diagram, the whole stimulus. They're just conscious of the part that they're reporting. And so different aspects are cued, and when they're cued, those are the bits that are conscious. There's something it's like to experience just those bits. So for the advocates of the spare view, only one or a few items are conscious. And this debate then leads to a distinction between the two theories, a debate between the two theories about the neuronal basis for processing the conscious stimuli. This is a diagram from Lamme where he argues that in the first top picture we have the first 100 milliseconds, which is a feed-forward feed-forward processing of the stimulus, and for the first 100 milliseconds that feed-forward sweep is unconscious. And then the bottom left diagram is where recurrent processing is beginning in the occipital cortex, the visual cortex, and in between 100 and 200 milliseconds, that recurrent processing then initiates phenomenal consciousness, which is where the person is conscious of the racket and the ball. And then only later at 300 milliseconds on the diagram on the right, that is when the the recurrent processing ignites globally, and that is when the information is capable of report. On the global neuronal workspace theory, it's only at the third diagram that consciousness occurs, and at the previous four the global neuronal workspace, prior to what they call global ignition at about 300 milliseconds, the stimulus processing is unconscious. So there's another debate then between these two views.